So as I write about in my book, Science and the Miraculous, which is my latest book that's out, we have all these various cases of miracles that are looked at through scientific inquiry by the Catholic Church. If you were here for the presentation last night, you got an in-depth presentation of that, but just to recap, the Catholic Church looks at medical healings like those found at Lourdes or in canonization causes. It looks at weeping icons, Marian apparitions, stigmata, incorruptible saints, and Eucharistic miracles. Those are all the ways that science is applied in these cases of inquiry. And Prospero Lambertini, who I mentioned yesterday, he's an Italian cardinal who was born in the 1600s, and he went on to become Pope Benedict XIV. And he wrote the entire rule book that's still even used at Lourdes and in the Vatican even today. They don't change too much in the church. And so he said that the disease must be serious and impossible to cure. It can't be in a stage liable to disappear on its own. It must be a spontaneous, complete, and lasting cure. No medical treatment and no other medical condition can cause the first condition to go away. So it's a very strict criteria. We also talked yesterday about weeping icons, where in these cases the Church will use X-ray technology to look for internal ductwork or other mechanisms to produce these tears. They rule out all natural explanations like condensation or a leaky pipe. They'll use video surveillance to capture it on film, and they do a chemical analysis of the tears to find out if they are actually human tears. And we also talked yesterday about visions of Mary. Because these things have happened over the ages so randomly, the Church can't really test it that well. But in cases like Medjugorje, where there's been a daily apparition for as many as 40 plus years, they've been able to hook up brain scanners to the visionaries. And the stigmata, we talked about this yesterday as well. Padre Pio is the most famous modern stigmatic. That's those cases where the wounds of Christ are manifest on the body of a mystic or saint. Incorruptible saints, again, we covered this yesterday, but there are cases, several hundred around the world, where there are some perfectly preserved saints throughout history. But to me, all these types of miracles have their own complications, and we talked about them a little bit yesterday. The incorrupt saints, they're not incorrupt for all time. The Marian apparitions, you need to rely on the testimony of a good witness. Weeping statues, there aren't any messages that go along with these things, so why is Mary weeping in the first place? They're all kind of complicated. But the most convincing miracle type of all, in my opinion, in my study of miracles over the last 20 years, are Eucharistic miracles. And so let's just recap. It was in the video you saw this morning as well, but let's recap Catholic belief in the Eucharist. And I have to say that there was something that caught my attention not too long ago, probably a year or so ago now. Richard Dawkins, the author of The God Delusion, he's a scientist and an atheist. He's very prominently, and he comes out speaking against science, against religion with science. He sent out a tweet about a year ago, and he said something like, the Catholics believe that the bread and wine are transformed into true flesh and true blood. It's not a symbol, and Catholics believe that. And sure enough, I read that, and I wasn't angry because I know he's an atheist. I know he's out there, he has an animus against the Church. But what really disappointed me was to read all the comments below that Twitter post. In those comments, they were saying, they said, "I'm Catholic, and no Catholic I know believes that this is truly the body and blood of Jesus Christ." And other Catholics said, "I've never even heard this. This is totally made up by Richard Dawkins." It was so sad to see hundreds and hundreds of comments exactly the same. Again, Dawkins I expect to be antagonistic to the Church, but people who call themselves Catholics don't even know that this is the belief of our Church. And so it's demoralizing to hear that, and I'm glad that the bishops are doing a Eucharistic revival right now. But this is the teaching of our Church. So what do Catholics really believe? So of course, we have this sense that we want to rely on science. It's show me the proof. And of course, we can date that all the way back to St. Thomas, the doubting Thomas, who had to put his hands in the wound in the side of Christ and in his hands to really believe. And King Louis IX of France, who's a saint, he actually has this story where when he was working in his study, he was writing, and a messenger came in. And the messenger said, "Come quick to the chapel. There is a Eucharistic miracle happening right now." And the king looked up and then went right back down to his writing, and he said, "I could believe no more in the Eucharistic reality than if a miracle were to really occur. I believe no matter what." This is what we're called to believe, whether or not we have proof of miracles happening in the Eucharist. Now, St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1274 to 1323, he was the one, as the video pointed out, that he came up with this concept of transubstantiation, or he at least put an explanation to it, where he said, the substance changes. The bread and wine changes into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, but the appearance remains. We call them the accidents, the look, the taste, molecular structure. It is possible that a Eucharistic host could get mold on it because it is truly bread in that case. So when we talk about the Eucharist in the Bible, we talk about the Last Supper, of course, and this is so essential, where we see that this is the beginning of our tradition of celebrating the Eucharist. But there's no more important passage in the entire Bible than John 6. And I know that if you were here for Trent's talk earlier today, he went through some of this already. But I think it's so important to understand this. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." And that is a pretty wild claim. But Jesus is a great preacher, isn't he? He uses all these rhetorical devices, he uses metaphors in order to explain to those people who don't understand what he's talking about. So is it possible that Jesus is just using some kind of symbolic language? Well, earlier in the Gospel of John, in John 10, he says that he is a door. Now, nobody really who would have heard that would have said, Jesus is saying he's made of wood and he needs to be opened up and closed. Nobody would say that. Nobody really thought that Jesus was a door. And in John 15, Jesus says, "I am the vine." And did anybody think that he was green or made of vegetation? No. They knew he was just using a metaphor. How do we know that Jesus wasn't using symbolic language when he was talking about, "You must eat my flesh and drink my blood"? Isn't that just, we must have Jesus in our hearts? So in John 6, he talks about him being a door and a vine, but in verse 51, he claims to be the living bread that followers must eat, and the bread which I shall give is my flesh. Now, what's so interesting about this is that if it were a metaphor, those crowds of thousands of people who gathered to see Jesus, they would have just said, "Great new metaphor, we like this one." But they heard this and they picked up and they left. The Jews were disputing amongst themselves, saying, "How can this man give us his flesh to eat?" And Jesus, talking to his disciples, says, "Do you also take offense at this?" Because the apostles, the disciples, they were thinking about leaving as well, because this was just plain crazy. And when the crowds began to disperse, Jesus could have said to those crowds, "Oh, I went a little overboard. Just kidding. I didn't really mean that. Come on back and I'll explain it." He let them go. And he emphasized, he doubled down, saying in verse 52, saying, "Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." And again, what if Jesus is saying we must have him in our hearts? In the Greek, in verse 54, we draw a comparison between phagio, which is eating, translated to English, and trago, which means to chew on or to gnaw on. So perhaps the better translation is something like, "You must chew my flesh," or "You must gnaw my flesh." That's a little bit different than just metaphorically having Jesus in your heart. And so in verse 67, he asks his disciples, "Will you also go away?" And at the Last Supper, famously, Jesus says, "Do this in memory of me." Now, this is something that's so important. It's celebrated on Catholic masses, on altars all around the world, each and every day of the year. We see this done in memory of Jesus. But Jesus asks us to eat his flesh and drink his blood. I mean, it's the most difficult of all Catholic teachings. I understand when people say they can't understand it or get on board with it, because it is such a wild claim.